Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Malaysian Flatbread. That's right, you're going to learn how to make Roti Canai from a guy that's only made it twice in his life. But according to my research, that's still 2 more times than your average person's made it. And whether it was beginner's luck or this is just easier to make than it looks, I was absolutely thrilled with how this came out. Plus, besides the bread, I'm going to show you how to make a very fast and easy curried red lentil dip to serve this with. But first things first, and to get started we'll go ahead and make our dough, which is going to start with some bread flour, to which we will add some white sugar, which in the actual recipe is sweetened condensed milk, but the sugar seemed to work fine. And then of course we'll also need a little bit of salt, followed by 1 beaten egg, some melted butter, and then last but not least just enough water to bring this dough together. And once all that's in there, we'll get in there with our hand, and we will start to mix this together digitally. And if you have feelings of deja vu as you watch this dough being mixed together, there's a good reason for that, since it's pretty much always the same routine. Okay, we mix everything in a bowl until it comes together, and all our ingredients pull away from the sides to form what we call in the business a shaggy dough. And then once we have this very rough dough formed, we'll go ahead and transfer everything to our work surface, and we will slowly and methodically knead this all together until we have a nice, smooth, relatively elastic ball of dough. And by the way, this is not going to be a super sticky, very soft dough, like you might be used to if you've made our pizza dough or bread recipes. All right, this is going to be a little bit on the firmer, stiffer side. But having said that, we don't want it too dry. So be careful not to add any more flour in unless you absolutely think you need it. And that's it. Once we're happy with how that looks and feels, we'll go ahead and form that into some kind of uniform shape, and then do our best to divide this into 8 equal portions. And yes, of course this would have been easier in a stand mixer with a dough hook. But just because we're cooking doesn't mean we can't sneak in a quick workout. And by the time I was finished, I was experiencing moderate sweating, an increased heart rate, and most importantly, elevated mood. So suit yourself, but this is only going to take about 5 to 7 minutes. And if you haven't done it before, kneading by hand is surprisingly satisfying. But either way, like I said, we'll go ahead and divide that into 8 equal pieces. Or I guess 6 if you want bigger flatbreads, or maybe 10 if you want smaller ones. But anyway, the point is it doesn't really matter as long as you make them all about the same size. So there's no fights at the table. And then we'll roll each one in our hands and or on the table to form a nice smooth ball. And then what we'll do before we transfer these onto a plate is coat each one in a little bit of vegetable oil. Or I guess if you wanted, you could use melted butter. But we are going to use a lot of melted butter later. And I find the vegetable oil to be a little easier to work with at this point. And that's it. Once our balls of dough have been lubricated, we'll go ahead and wrap this with plastic, and we will transfer this into the fridge to rest overnight, which apparently will give us the best results. And if you can only do that for a few hours, fine, it will still probably work, but overnight is the official recommendation. And while our dough is resting, we can move on to make our red lentil curry dip, which is going to start by tossing some diced onions into some melted butter set over medium-high heat, to which we will add some ginger and garlic, as well as a nice big pinch of salt, followed by a couple tablespoons of our favorite curry spice blend. And you could probably just stop right there, but I'm going to fortify mine with some additional spices, including paprika, cumin, freshly ground black pepper, and of course some cayenne. And what we'll do is stir all that together, and then saute it for about 3 or 4 minutes to not only soften and sweeten our onions, but of course also to wake up those spices in that hot butter, which maybe doesn't seem like a major thing, but it really is. And then what we'll do once we cook that for a few minutes is go ahead and add our tomato paste. And we will stir that in and cook that for another 3 minutes or so, or until it starts to toast and caramelize onto the bottom of the pan. And once it does, and looks a little something like this, that is our signal to add our liquids. The first of which would be some nice cold fresh water, followed by 1 can of full-fat coconut milk. Oh yeah, don't even think of using reduced fat coconut milk. Okay, we're going to need that fat. So we'll go ahead and stir that in, at which point we can add the star of the show, 1 cup of red lentils, which personally I would have called orange lentils, but I was not born yet when they were named. And yes, of course, any other color lentil will work, including actually red lentils, if those are even a thing. But anyway, we'll go ahead and stir those in. And then all we need to do here is wait for this to come up to a simmer, and then we will reduce our heat to medium-low, and then simmer this, stirring occasionally, for about 40 minutes or so, or until our lentils are completely tender and our curry is thickened up beautifully, and hopefully looks something very similar to this. And believe it or not, that's it. All we have left to do is give this a taste. In case it needs a little more salt, which it probably does, or some more heat, or whatever other adjustments you decide it needs. And once that's set, we'll just keep that on low heat until we're ready to use it with our crispy, hot, freshly made flatbreads, which is what we're doing next. So we'll go ahead and transfer our rested dough onto a lightly oiled work surface. Okay, just rub it down with a little bit of vegetable oil. And we'll give our dough a little pressing down. And we are also going to need some melted butter, which we will rub a little bit on the top now. And then as you'll see, we'll add more as we stretch this dough out. But before that, we should cover this and let our dough warm up a little bit, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, since it's going to be fairly firm when it's still cold. So we'll let that sit and warm up, at which point we will flatten that out with our hand. And then we will lose the plastic, and we will apply a little more melted butter to the top, at which point we will start stretching this dough from the center out, getting it as thin as possible. And because we oiled the counter, and we're using lots of butter on top, this really is surprisingly easy to stretch out. Plus, don't forget we're using bread flour, which is higher in protein, which means more gluten, which means we're going to have a nice stretchy, relatively tough dough, which shouldn't start to tear until we get very, very, very thin. Okay, so you're really going to have to use your senses here and go by touch and sight. I mean, you are, after all, to be real of what you see and feel. And speaking of insane membranes, this really is how far you need to go. All right, it should literally be see-through. And don't worry, a few small tears are not a problem. And then what we'll do once we have that stretched out and possibly thin is apply even more melted butter before we fold 2 sides in towards the center. And I'm still not quite sure if they're supposed to touch or overlap, so I kind of did both. Did I mention I've only done this twice? And then we will fold the other 2 edges in to basically form a square. At which point, according to the videos I watched, I'm supposed to be able to pick it up. I'm supposed to be able to pick it up and drop it on the table where it basically forms this perfect circle, except I have no idea how that's done. So after my failed attempt, I just formed it back into a square and decided to pretend that never happened. And if you're thinking, why didn't you practice a few times before you filmed this? Well, I did. This is after I practiced. And don't worry, as you'll see, the square works out just fine. But before we cook this, let's cover it with plastic and let it rest another 5 minutes, after which we'll flatten it out one last time before we head to the stove, where we are going to cook this over medium heat in a generous amount of melted clarified butter, which is simply melted butter that you skim the white foam off the top. And what we're going to do is cook this for about 3 to 4 minutes per side until the outside is beautifully browned and flaky and crispy, and our dough on the inside is fully cooked through, which, by the way, is why we're using medium heat. All right, if your pan's too hot, the outside's going to burn before the inside cooks through. So I think medium is about perfect, but you might even need to reduce that and go a little bit lower. All right, so don't be afraid to adjust that down. That is just you cooking. Speaking of which, when I'm cooking, I'm not one of these people that can just leave something in the pan for 3 minutes per side and only turn it once. Okay, I like to play with my food, so I gave mine a couple minutes on each side and then began flipping it back and forth. But anyway, what we're trying to accomplish here is a nicely browned and blistered, crunchy, crispy exterior with a still moist, stretchy, chewy interior. And by the way, there's a difference between moist dough and undercooked dough, which is why we have to make sure this cooks long enough. So basically, I'm just leaving this in the pan for as long as it can possibly go without it overcooking, which is where I was at right here. And then as soon as we remove this from the heat, we must, smush it with our hands to fluff it up. And they say it's to help separate those layers inside, but really I think it's more to release the steam. Okay, with all that butter and those layers being so thin, I think those are going to be separated regardless, but there is a tremendous amount of heat and steam inside, and I think this ritual scrunching helps release that. But again, what the heck do I know? And that's it after the old scrunch and fluff. We will plate that up next to our curried lentil dip, which I really think we should garnish with some freshly chopped cilantro, as well as some nice spicy sliced serrano peppers. And that's it, my Malaysian, allegedly, Roti Canai is ready to enjoy. And as I tear off this first piece, please listen carefully. Oh yeah, despite my profound lack of experience and knowledge, I do believe that's what it's supposed to sound like. And as far as the taste goes, any bread's going to be delicious dipped in a curry sauce like this. But this combination is just ridiculous. And it's going to sound kind of funny, but the best way for me to describe this flatbread is the world's thinnest Parker House roll. All right, thanks to the egg and the butter and the sugar, this really does have sort of a dinner roll flavor profile. Yet it's presented in this format that, as I mentioned earlier, features a contrast between that brown, crispy, flaky exterior and that tender, stretchy, buttery inside. So what I'm trying to say is you really need to make this. So I really did love everything about this, and I will be practicing, using all the tips and tricks I assume I'll be getting under the video. Oh, and by the way, after I finish this, I attempted to do an alternative spiralized version, and I think I'm actually going to post a little extra bonus video showing you how to do that. But in the meantime, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.